Close your eyes and picture a castle swallowed by fog, perched atop jagged hills in the cold Hungarian countryside. The stones are slick with dew, the air heavy with the mingling scents of smoke, damp earth, and faint decay. You hear whispers, not quite words, just trembling voices carried by the wind, hinting at secrets that have lingered for centuries. This is the world of Elizabeth Bathory, a woman whose name would echo through history not as a ruler or diplomat, but as a figure of terror, obsession, and unspeakable cruelty. Tonight, I will take you into her chambers, through her hallways, into the very heart of her darkness. You will feel the chill of fear, the brush of silk hiding menace, and the weight of history pressing down. Are you ready to step inside? The Countess was born into privilege, yet her childhood was steeped in violence, rigid social hierarchies, and whispered superstitions. From a young age, Elizabeth observed power not merely the authority of parents or teachers, but the subtle control that could bend servants, siblings, and even strangers to her will. She noticed the flicker of fear in a servant's eyes, the quiver of hands trying to hide mistakes. Something stirred in her, a fascination, an almost intoxicating thrill at watching another human tremble under her gaze. Her education was exceptional, even unusual for a girl of noble birth. She studied languages, literature, history, and the arts, yes, but also the darker sciences of the time. Alchemy, remedies, poisons, tales of plague, and rituals of death whispered secrets. Knowledge was power, and power could shape flesh, fear, and obedience. By the time she married Count Ferenc Nadasti, Elizabeth had learned to wield charm and intellect like weapons. Her castle became a maze of gilded corridors and hidden chambers, each corner a witness to secrets, whispers, and eventually horror. Even before her infamous obsession with blood, Elizabeth was drawn to the fragile, fleeting nature of life. She would wander the woods near the castle, watching a deer struggle in the underbrush, a bird caught by a hawk, noting the rot of leaves in the fall. Life was delicate, mortality swift, and in her mind, perhaps malleable. This curiosity, innocent at first, would curdle into something far darker, planting the seeds of obsession that would consume her and those who crossed her path. Elizabeth Bathory's ascent into notoriety began not with screams, but with whispers. Her beauty was as striking as it was cold, a pale mask that concealed an intellect razor-sharp and an ambition unyielding. In the grand halls of her family's castle, she moved like a shadow, eyes always observing, noting the subtlest tremor of a servant's hand, the fleeting glance of a companion unsure of loyalty. Even her smiles were calculated, a mixture of charm and menace, capable of lifting hearts or sowing unease with equal precision. Those who encountered her often remembered not just her appearance, but the feeling that she could see into the very marrow of their being. The Countess was a woman of contrasts. She hosted lavish banquets in gilded halls, where candles flickered over tables piled with roasted meats, fine wines, and delicate pastries. Yet beneath the glitter lay meticulous control. Every servant, every guest, was measured for obedience, loyalty, and usefulness. A misplaced goblet or a hesitating curtsy could earn a sharp glance that lingered, a silent reminder that in her domain, mistakes were not forgiven lightly. This meticulousness, admired by some, was the early seed of terror. She understood human frailty, and she knew how to exploit it. It was during this period that Elizabeth became fascinated with the concept of youth and vitality, particularly its fragility. She studied herbs, tinctures, and the folklore of rejuvenation, and she became obsessed with the fleeting glow of life.
Young girls, often the daughters of minor nobility or peasantry, were brought to her castle under the pretense of education, work, or patronage. To an outsider, she appeared benevolent, instructing them in etiquette, dance, and literacy. Yet Elizabeth observed them with the intensity of a predator. Every whisper, every blush, every hesitant step fascinated her, as though she were cataloging the essence of youth itself. Power and fear were intertwined in Elizabeth's mind. The first known instances of cruelty were subtle, almost imperceptible: a servant confined in a cold chamber for hours, a horse's harness tightened painfully, a girl forced to remain standing long past exhaustion. These acts, seeming minor to contemporaries, were the beginnings of a psychological map Elizabeth testing the limits of control, of human endurance, of obedience. She learned which fears could break a person silently, which could bend them to her will. And as these small cruelties escalated, so too did her reputation, whispered among villages and towns, until the first shadow of the Blood Countess began to emerge in fear-stricken murmurs. The castle's corridors seemed to take on a life of their own. Elizabeth moved through them like a conductor of dread, her presence a silent drumbeat of authority and menace. Servants and visitors alike began to sense that their time, their bodies, their secrets were never entirely their own within these walls. Even her own family noted a shift. The once playful and curious girl had grown into a figure both magnetic and terrifying, capable of inspiring loyalty, love, and an almost irrational fear. The stage was set for what would become one of history's most chilling obsessions, one that blurred the line between fascination and monstrosity, between human desire and unrestrained cruelty.
The very first, almost imperceptible hints of Elizabeth Bathory's emerging darker impulses began as mere whispers, soft enough to be easily dismissed by anyone passing through the grand yet foreboding halls of her sprawling castle, echoing faintly off stone walls and high vaulted ceilings, yet carrying the sinister undertone of something that would grow into an unstoppable force of terror. But as days turned into weeks, those seemingly trivial whispers slowly intensified, evolving into tremors of anxiety and apprehension that unsettled even the bravest servants and residents, until the tremors themselves gave way to outright panic, spreading through the castle like wildfire, infecting the daily routines of all who dwelt there. Young girls, brought from nearby villages or distant noble households, under the pretense of education, service, or patronage, began mysteriously disappearing from the meticulously structured daily routines, vanishing in ways that at first seemed like unfortunate mishaps, perhaps a misstep down the spiral stone staircase that wound endlessly within the castle's towers, or a fall upon the slippery cobblestones of the icy courtyard. Yet, as the growing tally of missing names became undeniable, the pattern could no longer be ignored by anyone with eyes to see or ears to hear. And Elizabeth herself observed it all from behind the thick folds of heavy velvet curtains, her gaze an unsettling mixture of curiosity, cold calculation, and dark anticipation, noting minutely how fear and the shadow of dread reshaped the behavior of every servant, visitor, and subordinate within her reach. The castle itself, ancient and imposing, seemed almost to breathe with the tension she meticulously cultivated, its long corridors reverberating with unspoken dread and a sense of imminent peril that clung to every stone, tapestry, and shadow. Elizabeth's obsession with the fragility of youth, vitality, and the transient nature of life soon evolved into a ritualistic compulsion so dark and methodical that it bordered on the ceremonial.
She tested the limits of human endurance and the pliability of the mind and body, selecting her victims with a meticulous care that reflected both genius and madness. Girls were confined for hours in cold, dimly lit chambers, forced into exhausting physical routines, or subjected to chilling baths under the guise of purification, all while Elizabeth's mind catalogued each reaction with precise, almost scientific attention, noting how flesh could writhe and psyche could fracture under carefully applied pressure. She did not merely delight in the act of suffering itself, but in the slow, deliberate unraveling of innocence, the subtle tremors of uncertainty flickering across eyes that had once shone with naivete and hope. She discovered that fear, in its most refined form, was a delicate and precise art, comparable to the intricate embroidery adorning her own noble garments, requiring patience, timing, and meticulous attention to detail. As years passed, the cruelty that had begun in subtle ways escalated into acts so heinous and incomprehensible that they became an elaborate, perverse study of mortality, biology, and the boundaries of human sensation. Elizabeth would immerse herself in the blood of young virgins, a grotesque ritual born of superstition and the belief that it would preserve her beauty and prolong vitality, executed with meticulous precision and unwavering ritualistic discipline. The castle's chambers, which had once resounded with laughter and music, now stood silent witnesses to horror. Walls absorbed muffled cries that began faintly and escalated into piercing shrieks, an ambient terror that seeped into every stone, shadow, and hidden recess. Servants, family members, and attendants, whether motivated by loyalty, fear, or sheer necessity, became unwilling participants in this theater of dread, unable to reconcile their allegiance to the Countess with the atrocities they observed day after day, trapped in a moral and psychological bind that left them complicit in her crimes. The Countess's notorious reputation inevitably extended beyond the walls of her formidable castle, reaching neighboring villages, distant nobility, and curious travelers, all of whom murmured cautiously about the strange occurrences and vanishing girls. Yet the combination of her high social status and the fear she instilled served as an almost impenetrable shield against consequence or scrutiny. Letters, chronicles, and travelers' accounts described Elizabeth Bathory in contradictory terms, simultaneously mesmerizing and monstrous, a woman whose physical beauty held the promise of enchantment, while her piercing eyes reflected a darkness capable of extinguishing hope and instilling profound dread. Local legends gradually intertwined with factual reports, casting Elizabeth as part myth and part historical figure, her obsessions blurring the line between human and predator, reason and insanity. By the conclusion of this phase of her life, the castle itself had been transformed into both sanctuary and tomb, a place where life, death, and fear coexisted under the Countess's meticulous, horrifying control, embodying the very essence of terror and obsessive domination that would define her enduring legend.
By the time Elizabeth Bathory had entered the height of her power, the distinction between ritual and obsession had blurred entirely. The castle's walls no longer contained mere echoes of footsteps. They absorbed shrieks, muffled sobs, and the rhythmic, almost ritualistic sounds of suffering. The Countess moved among her victims with an air of detached precision, yet her eyes betrayed an insatiable hunger for control. Every scream, every twitch of terror became a note in the symphony she conducted, a dark melody composed of flesh and fear. Servants, guards, and visiting nobles witnessed the transformations, noting how the once innocent girl servants would emerge gaunt, trembling, their eyes hollow, yet obedient. Fear, Elizabeth realized, was a pliable substance.
and she molded it as a sculptor molds clay, shaping loyalty, despair, and desperation into a single instrument under her hand. The obsession with blood deepened into ritualized consumption, a grotesque alchemy in which Elizabeth believed the vitality of youth could be transferred to herself. She would immerse herself in the blood of virgins, her skin rising in gooseflesh from the icy bath, yet her face radiating a distorted satisfaction. Each act was carefully timed, measured, and repeated with a meticulous attention to detail that bordered on mania. The Countess's psyche fractured further. Hallucinations crept into her waking hours, whispering that the blood itself called to her, that it demanded completion. At night, she would wander corridors lined with paintings of saints and ancestors, their eyes seeming to judge, yet she found in their silent gaze a perverse encouragement to continue. The boundaries between reality and ritual dissolved, leaving only a cathedral of horror built around her own obsessions. Stories began to spread, even as fear silenced the witnesses. Nobles whispered about missing girls, about the strange rituals of the Countess, yet no one dared confront her openly. Elizabeth herself began to feel invulnerable, cocooned in wealth, status, and the terror she inspired. She experimented further: confinement, sensory deprivation, and elaborate tortures that tested both body and mind. Each victim became a living testament to her own insidious genius, each cry a mirror reflecting her internal madness. The castle, once a seat of feudal authority and familial pride, had become a theater of psychological horror, where life was measured not in days or seasons, but in the degree of terror inflicted and endured. And yet, amidst the cruelty, there were glimpses of Elizabeth's complex psyche, moments when she appeared almost fragile, staring out at the snow-blanketed countryside, a woman haunted by her own appetites, a mind aware of its descent, yet powerless to intervene. She inhabited a paradox, a figure of beauty and sophistication, and simultaneously a vessel of horror. Her obsession was both timeless and immediate, a meditation on power, desire, and the human capacity for cruelty. By the end of this act, Elizabeth Bathory had transformed not only her victims, but the very fabric of the world around her. The castle was no longer merely stone and timber, but a living, breathing extension of her mind, a landscape of obsession, fear, and the perverse allure of unchecked power.
Inevitably, the web of terror spun by Elizabeth Bathory began to unravel. Whispers turned into testimonies, and rumors became undeniable reports. Servants, emboldened by fear mingled with desperation, found ways to escape and recount what they had endured. Nobles, whose own daughters had vanished into the castle, demanded answers, and the legal machinery of the kingdom began to turn, albeit cautiously, against a woman of immense power. Yet Elizabeth, in her isolated fortress of stone and blood, seemed almost detached from the encroaching reality. She moved through the halls as always, yet her movements carried a subtle stiffness, a hint that the ritualized frenzy that had once animated her now faltered in the face of scrutiny. As investigators descended upon her domain, they were confronted with a scene that defied comprehension. Chambers lined with the remnants of unimaginable suffering, pools of blood long dried, and signs of ritualistic obsession etched into the very stones. Witnesses described the meticulous cruelty of her methods, the psychological torment as carefully administered as the physical. Elizabeth's mind, already fraying from years of immersion in her own obsessions, now confronted the intrusion of external judgment. For the first time, the Countess felt the weight of consequence. Yet her awareness did not bring humility, only a deeper, darker defiance. In her perception, the world outside the castle walls was as fragile and corruptible as the blood she had so carefully harvested, and she alone had touched the ultimate truth, that mortality could be delayed and fear could be commanded. Her imprisonment marked both an end and a transformation. Locked away in her own chambers, Elizabeth was left to confront herself, stripped of the instruments of her power, yet still enveloped in the echoes of her atrocities. She wandered the halls, conversing with shadows, reliving every scream, every ritual, every act of calculated horror. In the silence, the psychological toll became evident, a mind oscillating between denial and acknowledgement, moments of lucidity tainted by guilt, and an obsessive compulsion that could no longer find an outlet in the flesh of others. The Countess's legacy, paradoxically, was born of both horror and fascination. Chroniclers, inquisitors, and storytellers alike would record her deeds, embellish them, and turn them into cautionary tales that would endure through centuries. The world beyond her prison walls continued its rhythms, oblivious to the intimate horrors that had once consumed Csejte Castle. Yet Elizabeth Bathory's shadow lingered, both in the corridors of memory and in the dark fascination of those who ponder the limits of human cruelty. Her story serves as a mirror to modern obsessions with power, with beauty, with the lengths to which individuals will go to assert control over others. It asks uncomfortable questions about morality, influence, and the vulnerability of those silenced by fear. As the centuries passed, the legend of the Blood Countess became more than a record of acts. It became a meditation on the human psyche, a warning that the thirst for dominance unchecked by conscience can create horrors both timeless and immediate, leaving a legacy that haunts both history and imagination.
Long after the castle gates closed behind Elizabeth Bathory, her presence did not vanish. The halls she once haunted remained empty, yet whispered with memory. The stones seemed to absorb the horrors enacted within them, as if the walls themselves had learned cruelty. Chroniclers, priests, and local villagers passed down the tales, each retelling layering myth atop fact, blending historical atrocity with legend. The Blood Countess became a symbol of the extremes of human obsession, a cautionary figure whose deeds were too grotesque to forget, yet too compelling to ignore. Her story, when reflected upon today, resonates beyond the medieval world. It is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the vulnerability of those silenced by status, and the corrosive effect of obsession. Modern society, in its fascination with true crime and historical darkness, often peers into the same abyss that Elizabeth once inhabited. In understanding her, we confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, our capacity for cruelty, our obsession with beauty, and the ways fear can be wielded as a tool of control. The legacy of Elizabeth Bathory endures, not just in books or films, but in the moral and psychological questions she leaves behind. What drives someone to commit unspeakable acts? How does power warp perception? And perhaps most hauntingly, how easily can society turn a blind eye until the consequences are undeniable? Her story, her crimes, and the terror she wrought continue to captivate because they speak to a universal tension, the fragile line between fascination and horror, and the human impulse to dominate or be dominated. In the quiet corners of Csejte Castle or in the imagination of those who study her, Elizabeth Bathory lingers. She is a reminder that history is not merely dates and names, but a record of human extremes of ambition, obsession, cruelty,
and the enduring shadow of those who crossed every boundary of morality. And though centuries have passed, the echo of the Blood Countess still resonates, compelling us to confront the darkness that can exist within power, and perhaps within ourselves.